A crying boy. In 1997, after acquiring enough savings, I moved my wife, Deborah, and two daughters, Shirley and Clarice, into the suburbs of Baltimore, Maryland. The house in particular was a large duplex with friendly, inviting neighbours and a generally warm atmosphere, so we expected nothing more than the usual living accommodations. The history of the house was never explained to me thoroughly by the manager, but this did not bug me in the slightest. The first several weeks went by with little to no dilemma, as we managed to unpack and set up our belongings rather quickly. Deborah would call me while I was at work at a local computer scripting service, telling me how great our new home was and boasting about the easy living, which included enough rooms for all of us and a pool out back. I would smile and agree. Shirley and Clarice also loved the house and found plenty of games to play around in the large space availability. The two slept in the same room together near ours, so they could easily access us in case of emergency. By the 5th week of living here, the two came storming into our bedroom doorway very late into the night, both claiming to hear a little boy crying near their bedroom window. Deborah and I both exchanged confused and frightened looks, but proceeded to examine their room. It was relatively empty, save for a few toys lying about. "We heard it, Daddy," they both exclaimed. "Heard what?" I asked, puzzled. They both began to describe the boy as sounding very much afraid and crying through the night, even singing to himself quietly at one point. I peered out the window and turned my gaze downwards. Nothing. I exchanged them both confused looks and decided it was best to have them sleep between Deborah and I in our bedroom. They nodded in agreement and I tucked them inside. Granted, I was unable to fall asleep for a while, but eventually drifted off after an hour or so, throughout which I did not hear the mysterious crying. A dream began, however, and I found myself in an open field, bound plentiful with wheat. I shoved through the tall grass, and our new house eventually came into view. But the houses that would be around it were not visible. I entered the threshold and saw that the house was empty and that pieces of furniture had been randomly stacked atop each other. Odd, I thought. I made my way to the curio and approached the swimming pool. I slowly turned my attention to the very bottom of the pool, for which a young boy lay in a sleeping position below. The boy promptly disappeared and reappeared before me on dry land. Who are you?" I asked nervously, clenching my hands in disbelief. The boy, who was around 6 or 7 years of age and dressed in rusty overalls and striped tee, slowly looked up into me, his misty eyes staring right up into mine. Despite this outward appearance, he seemed friendly, and I perished any thought of trying to fight him. "I'm sorry," the boy responded. "It's okay," I replied back, patting him on the shoulder. We talked for a while and he seemed content during the conversation, almost pleased that I was with him. At this point he grabbed my hand and began to mutter gibberish under his breath. I stood motionless and urged him to quit, but he seemed to have entered a somewhat possessed state, and the strange words became louder. "Where is she?" he suddenly asked, his face now wrinkled up in anger. He repeated this several times. Each time his grip became stronger. "I don't know," I snapped back, attempting to break free of his iron grip, to no avail. He remained silent at this point and continued to strengthen his grip, becoming more and more persistent by the expression on his face. After an intense struggle, I pulled my arm free and pushed him away, making a beeline for the front door and making no stops to look behind. I finally exited the door and ran out into the fields. The house was now lit aflame, and I could see the boy screaming in agony from one of the upward windows. I felt guilty and ashamed, but I could not do anything to help the boy. I awoke into the dark of night, breathing heavily and sweating intensely. Deborah took notice and calmed me, using the sheets to wipe me down. "What happened, dear? Did you have a nightmare?" she asked, worried. Yes, I replied. "Just go back to sleep," she said. We managed to fall back asleep. Shortly afterwards, I could not recall any dreams afterwards. The next morning, I asked the manager to evaluate more on the building's history. He gave me this look of despair and finally delivered. He told me that the building once burst into flames some 20 years prior due to an accident of unknown cause. According to his claim, one of the past owner's sons died in the cataclysm and was unable to be rescued by firefighters. The house was rebuilt, he continued, but some say it has remained the same. Can we play? Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. When I was really little, I dreamed I was playing with this other girl about my age, about 6 or 7. We were playing with her Barbies and really just having fun. I had noticed she was extremely pale, even for a white girl. She had a small pouty face with blonde straight hair. She looked as though she had been playing outside, as her face was covered in dirt. She also seemed very reserved and timid. I remember giving her a really large smile as we stopped playing for a moment. As I did so, I watched her own smile disappear and her lower her head. I asked her what was wrong. "You know we can't ever play together again, right?" I remember I felt really sad and I promised her I would come back. But she just looked at me and said, "But I'm dead. You can't." Before I could protest, I woke up in the middle of the night. I looked around the dark room, only hearing my little brother's deep breaths from the bed across from mine. So I went back to sleep, not thinking too much about it. Many years later, I was about 10. I had a very familiar dream. I was standing in her house. I remember going by a reclining chair with a man as pale as her, fast asleep. He had been watching the television, I think, but now all that played was the snow and the harsh sound of its feedback. Having silently slipped by him, I then made my way through the dark rooms, calling her name. I never could remember it when awake. In a voice that was barely above a whisper. Finally, I came to a room with no door. I peered inside, and there she was, still playing with the same dolls as before. She looked as though she hadn't moved from the spot since last time. Even her appearance was the same. I ran up to her, very excited to finally be able to see my friend once more. In my excitement, I grabbed and hugged her. This was my first time touching her, and I remember that she was very cold. She felt like ice, and her body was very stiff. When I pulled away, she just looked at me, her face contorted in a mixed expression of shock and confusion. I had expected her to be happy to see me, so what? She really freaked me out. "You're not supposed to be here." She wasn't hateful in her tone. Rather, she seemed frightened for me. I shrugged it off and told her I had missed her, and I finally had come back to play. She shook her head no, very vigorously, and I was becoming frightened. "You can't be here. You can't come more than once. If they find out you are here, you won't be able to leave. They won't let you leave." I was really frightened by her words. They made me want to cry. I very softly asked her who they were and why I couldn't leave. She told me the others that lived in the house. She said they would be mad that I'm here, and then she said something that has truly haunted me all these years. She said, "You will be stuck here just like me." I wanted to leave. I asked her how I could leave and where the door was, but she told me I couldn't leave like that. She said she had to hide me till I woke up. I don't remember where I was hiding, but I remember she chose to hide with me. She told me they were all mean to her, and I was the nicest person she had met since she got there. She said she wanted me to stay, but that she didn't want me to be sad. What felt like hours passed by, till the man in the chair could be heard stirring. He got up and I noticed he didn't touch the floor so much. Rather, he glided as he made the motions of walking. I don't recall how the events unfolded, but as he went looking for her, we both became scared. We decided to move from there to another room. She said that we had to hide in the bathroom. It was the only door with a lock. I agreed with her, and we began to make our way down the hall. As fate would have it, we stumbled upon another person inhabiting the house. She motioned for me to be quiet, as he had his hands covering his face. I could hear him crying very audibly, and though she said to be quiet, I ventured to console him. As my first words escaped my mouth, his cries stopped. The hall became deadly silent, and the girl began to frantically tug on my shirt. He uncovered his face as she pulled me further down the hall, but I continued to look at him for a short time. He looked at us with those eyeless holes, and his scream and the way his mouth opened were unbelievable. It looked as though his jaw came unlatched, and the howl he let out sounded of pure hatred and anger. I was terrified. She grabbed my hand and we began to run. We made our way down the narrow hallway as we did. The screams of all the others who stayed there filled the house. They were all chasing us now. We finally reached the door. She shoved me in quickly and entered herself. She then proceeded to lock the door. We could hear them all yelling and screeching from behind the door, and then it grew silent. For a moment, I felt relief wash over me. They were going to leave us be. But then I turned to face her, and her eyes told a different story. There was this look of irrational fear on her face as she watched the door. I now knew this wasn't over. That's when the banging began. It was hard and very precise, each thud rattling the door with its strength. "Give me the girl." It was the voice of a man. He seemed very angry, and from the way she squeezed my hand when he spoke, I knew she was afraid of him. The banging and that one phrase continued on. After what felt like a few minutes, the thud stopped. I was too afraid to grant myself a moment of full security, and I was right to do so. He began to ram his shoulder into the door, now screaming that he wanted me. I'm not sure how, but I knew this was the man in front of the television. The door began to give way, and I became increasingly frightened. That's when she did something I will never forget. She came to kneel in front of me and pleaded for me to wake up. She said she couldn't let him have me. Her hands grasped my shoulders tightly as tears welled up in my eyes, and that's when the door finally broke open. She grabbed me, wrapping me in her arms, and began to hold me as tight as she could, and I began to scream for my life. It is then that I finally woke up. I'd woken myself up with my incessant screaming. At first everything was black, and so I didn't stop screaming. It wasn't till I realised I was in my bed and actually opened my eyes that I stopped. Above my face was my dad's, and from the look on it, it seemed he was scared. He said I had been screaming for a while, but he couldn't wake me up. He said he had poked and shaken me, but I wouldn't open my eyes and I wouldn't stop screaming. He asked if I had a nightmare, but I told him that I had a dream that I'd had once before. I said that I dreamed I went to play with a friend, but her family didn't like me. To this day, I have never dreamed of the girl or her house again. I know it's a little choppy and vague, but it's been 10 years since I had these dreams. I recently began thinking about that little girl and everything that happened. It truly scared me, and so I thought to share it with others. And that's it for tonight, my little hellhounds. Thanks for listening. And just to let you know, I now have Patreon, where I will be posting exclusive videos and stories that will not be aired on YouTube. So, if you care to support the channel and join the chat and listen to exclusive scaries, then head over to my Patreon. The link will be in the description. And if you have any scary stories you want narrated on the channel, then submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Don't forget to like and subscribe and click the bell icon so you get notified every time I upload. Now, good night, my little hellhounds.